Hello everyone, welcome to Hayes Secret Tales. Please enjoy this video.
It is 3 in the morning and Darius Cole has just gone completely still. Not the stillness of sleep, the stillness of a man who has just heard something that is rearranging everything he thought he knew about himself. His hand is on mine in the dark. The lamp is still on. His voice, when it finally comes, is barely above a whisper. He says, "Say it again." And I do. I tell him I am in love with him, that I have been for 2 years, that I built an entire system of rules to protect both of us from exactly this moment, and now he is looking at me like the system was always going to fail, like maybe he was always going to be the reason it did. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. My name is Tobias Ward, and I want to be very clear about something before any of this makes sense. I am not the kind of person who falls for straight men. I have never been that person. I have watched friends do it. Watch them pour themselves into people who could not pour back. Watch them justify and excuse and wait and finally shatter. And I swore from the time I was 19 years old and figured out who I was that I would never do that to myself. I was careful. I was intentional. Every person I dated was out, was sure, was not in the middle of some private war with himself that I would eventually become collateral damage in. I had rules. I had a whole system. And then I met Darius Cole at Camille's birthday dinner 3 years ago, and the system broke so quietly I didn't even notice it happening until it was too late. He was sitting at the far end of the table when I walked into the restaurant that night, laughing at something someone had said, his whole face open with it. And I remember thinking, objectively, that he was one of the most beautiful people I had seen in a long time. That was allowed. I was gay, not dead. I could notice beauty. I sat down across from him and 2 seats to the left, and Camille introduced us. And he reached across the bread basket and shook my hand with this grip that was warm and firm and not performative about it. Not the kind of handshake men use to establish something. Just a real handshake. Like he was actually glad to meet me. He worked in architecture. He had grown up in Atlanta before his family moved to Chicago when he was 15. He had opinions about music that were wrong in interesting ways, and he was not embarrassed to be corrected on them, which was its own kind of rare. He talked to me like I was someone worth talking to, which sounds like a low bar. But you would be surprised how many people in a room full of people still manage to make you feel peripheral. Darius never made me feel peripheral. He had a girlfriend that night. Her name was Priya, and she was beautiful and sharp-tongued and clearly very smart. And they had been together for 2 years. I registered all of this on the first night and filed it where it belonged, in the category of information that did not affect me because it was not my business. He was taken. He was straight. He was going to be my friend's friend at birthday dinners, and that was the end of the story. I was very rational about it. Then Camille started hosting monthly dinners, and Darius was always there, and we started sitting next to each other because the conversation was easy, and we both arrived early because we were both, it turned out, constitutionally incapable of being late to things. And one dinner became him texting me a link to an article about a building in Tokyo he thought I would find interesting, because I had mentioned once that I had a background in design before I switched to copywriting. And that became a thread of recommendations back and forth. Music and books and films and restaurants neither of us had been to yet. And somewhere in that thread, over the course of about 6 months, he became one of my closest friends. I told my best friend Petra about it. She asked me 2 questions. First, was I attracted to him? Second, did I think he was even slightly, even in a locked-away corner of himself, attracted to men? I answered yes to the first. I answered no to the second, because the evidence available to me at the time strongly suggested that no was the correct answer. He talked about Priya with ease and warmth. He was not the kind of man who performed straightness because he was performing anything at all. He was just a person who was drawn to women and had always been drawn to women and had no particular inner conflict about it that I could detect. Petra said, "Be careful." I said, "I am always careful." I was not always careful. The thing about falling for someone slowly is that you can almost convince yourself it isn't happening. There is no single moment you can point to and say, that is where it went wrong, that is where I crossed the line. It is accumulative. It is the way he remembered things I mentioned in passing and brought them up weeks later to ask if I had followed through. It is the way he texted me after something happened in the news that he knew would make me angry, not to discuss it, just to say, "I know you are furious right now. I'm furious too." It is the way he showed up to help me move to my new apartment on a Saturday morning with coffee and his truck and 4 hours of his time, and then stayed for dinner because we ran out of things to move, and neither of us wanted to stop talking. It is the night he and Priya broke up, after 2 years and some months, and he called me from the parking garage of his office at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday. His voice very flat and controlled the way some people get when they are trying to keep the lid on something. I stayed on the phone with him for 2 hours. I walked him through it the way you walk a friend through it. I did not say anything I was not entitled to say. I was a good friend. I am still proud of that. The moment I admitted to myself that I was in love with him came 3 weeks after that phone call. We were at his apartment watching a film, something with subtitles that neither of us was fully paying attention to, and he fell asleep against the arm of the couch, his head tilted back, and I looked at him for a moment in the blue light of the television and thought, with a clarity that was almost physical, I would do anything for this man, not as a friend, as something that did not have a safe word for it. I got up and poured a glass of water and stood in his kitchen for 5 minutes talking myself down from the edge of something I could not undo. Then I went back and watched the rest of the film and made sure I was gone before he was fully awake. And I did not tell anyone for 3 weeks, not even Petra. I told Petra eventually. She said, "I knew." I said, "Why didn't you warn me better?" She said, "I did warn you." I said, "Warn me harder next time." She said there would not be a next time because I was going to figure this out and get over it. I was working on it. I was genuinely working on it. I had started a very sensible, very healthy system of reminding myself of all the reasons this was not a road I could go down without destroying something I needed in my life. He was my friend. He was straight. He was newly single and fragile in the way newly single people are, even when they do not show it. And I had a rule, which was that I did not fall for straight men. The system was imperfect but functional. It worked the way most systems work when they are maintained properly. And it kept working right up until the night of Camille's 29th birthday party, which was 3 weeks ago, and which broke every rule I had. The party was at Camille's apartment on the 14th floor of a building in Lincoln Park. One of those places with a view that justifies everything. The rent, the noise, the windows that let in too much cold in January. She had invited about 40 people, which was a lot for her apartment, but worked because everyone was packed in close enough that the conversation had to be intimate, whether it wanted to be or not. I arrived at 8:30, which was early for this crowd, and found Camille in the kitchen dramatically narrating the correct method for making a Negroni to 3 people who did not ask. I kissed her cheek and poured myself something and moved into the living room. Darius was not there yet, which was unusual because he was also constitutionally incapable of being late. I checked my phone. No message. I assumed he was stuck on the train and found a corner of the room where I could see the door and started a conversation with Camille's colleague Rory, who was talking about a renovation project in a way that was genuinely interesting for about 4 minutes, and then became a complaint about building codes that I smiled through patiently. Darius arrived at 8:47. I know the time because I glanced at my phone when the door opened, reflexively, the way I had apparently been glancing at the door every 3 minutes since I arrived without meaning to. He was wearing a dark green jacket I had not seen before, charcoal trousers, and he looked in the entirely objective way I had trained myself to notice these things, like someone had taken the concept of composure and assembled it into a person. He scanned the room. He found me. He raised one hand in acknowledgement, the small economy of motion greeting we had developed over 3 years of knowing each other, and I raised mine back. And then he was absorbed into the party, and I returned my attention to Rory's building code complaint. He found me again 20 minutes later, appearing at my elbow with a drink in each hand. He held one out. I said, "I already have one." He said, "Now you have 2, which is better." He said hello to Rory, who said hello back and found a reason to drift toward the kitchen. And then it was just the 2 of us in the particular way it often ended up, just the 2 of us at parties, not because we excluded people, but because we tended toward the same gravitational field and ended up in orbit around each other without planning it. He looked tired, I thought. Not in a visible way, in the way I had learned to read on him, which was a small tightness around the jaw and a quality of stillness in the eyes that was different from his usual stillness. I asked if he was all right. He said yes, then revised it to mostly. I asked if something had happened. He said he had run into Simone's sister that afternoon, which was the first time he had heard anything about Simone in 2 months, and the sister had been perfectly pleasant, and Simone was apparently doing well, and none of this was information that should have affected him. But the encounter had unsettled him in the way random ambushes do. I said, "That sounds like a Tuesday." He laughed, which loosened something in his face. He said he was glad I was here. I said I was always here, which was true. Simone was the girlfriend after Priya. He had started seeing her about 8 months after the breakup with Priya, and they had lasted just over a year before it ended in October, quietly, by mutual agreement, without the kind of devastation that the Priya breakup had carried. He had been sad about it, but functional. He had not called me from any parking garages. I had been appropriately supportive, without crossing any lines I wasn't permitted to cross. We had carried on. The party moved the way good parties move, in loose currents, people drifting together and apart, the music adjusting in volume every 20 minutes, depending on who was closest to the speaker. Camille made a speech that was heartfelt and also slightly chaotic, because she had been drinking since 5. Someone brought out a cake with 30 candles on it, which she pretended to be offended by, and then blew out with unnecessary force, sending frosting onto the person standing nearest to her, who was Darius, who accepted this with the equanimity of a person who has attended many of Camille's parties and knows what to expect. I was across the room when this happened. I watched him wipe frosting from his jacket with a napkin while Camille apologized without really apologizing, and he was smiling, and I made myself look away. This was part of the system, not staring, not cataloging his expressions like they were something worth cataloging. I was a person with a system, and the system worked. Except that at some point, during the cake-cutting portion of the evening, the apartment thinned out in the way parties thin out after midnight, people collecting their coats and their significant others and filtering toward the door, and the group condensed from 40 down to 12 and then to 8, and then, by 1:30, to 5. Camille was on the couch with her girlfriend Jade, the two of them sharing a blanket and speaking in the low murmur of people who have forgotten anyone else is in the room. Rory was asleep in the armchair with his shoes on. A couple named Bex and Ferran were in the kitchen doing dishes because they were that kind of people, the best kind. And Darius and I were on the window seat on opposite ends, the city spread out behind the glass below us. Our drinks no longer cold. I should have left at midnight. I had known this. I had a 45-minute commute on a good night, and this was not a good night for trains. This was a Friday, and the last reliable train would run in about 20 minutes, and I had registered this fact clearly and done nothing about it. Darius was talking about a project he was working on, a mixed-use development on the south side that he was excited about and also frustrated with. The particular frustration of something worth doing that was being made unnecessarily difficult. I was listening, which was not an act of discipline. It was just that he was interesting when he talked about work. He got this focused quality that displaced the tiredness I had seen in him earlier, and it was good to see him animated. I was listening and also, peripherally, aware of the train I was not catching. He stopped mid-sentence and said, "What time is it?" I told him. He said, "Tobias, you're going to miss the last train." I said, "I know." He said, "Why didn't you say something?" I said, "You were mid-sentence." He looked at me for a moment with an expression I did not immediately know what to do with. Something somewhere between exasperation and something warmer. He said, "You can stay here." I said, "I don't want to impose." He said, "You have stayed here before," which was true. I had slept on his couch twice in the 3 years of our friendship. Once when a snowstorm made travel genuinely inadvisable, and once when we had been up until 4 in the morning working through a problem with a script I was writing and it made no sense for me to leave. I said, "Are you sure?" He said, "I have a couch, Tobias. It is not moved." I said, "All right." He said, "Good," and turned back to the window and continued talking about the mixed-use development. And I adjusted my position on the window seat so that I was facing the room rather than the glass. And somewhere in the reorganization of that small posture, I noticed that the space between us on the window seat had decreased. I did not remark on this. We said goodbye to Camille and Jade around 2, both of them half asleep and waving us toward the door, with the gratitude of people who want their apartment back, but are too fond of their guests to say so directly. Rory was still in the armchair. Bex and Ferran had gone. Darius locked the door behind us with Camille's spare key, which he had for reasons neither of them had ever fully explained, and we waited for the elevator in the hallway of the 14th floor, with the sound of the city muffled 14 stories below us. He lived 4 blocks from Camille. The walk in late October at 2 in the morning was cold and very quiet. The kind of quiet that only exists in a city in the very small hours, when the noise has not yet built back up toward morning. We walked close together because the sidewalk narrowed between parked cars and building fronts, and it made sense to walk close together. Our shoulders almost touched. I counted steps. This is a thing I do when I am trying not to think about something. I count steps, or I count breaths, or I identify things in my peripheral vision in alphabetical order. A fire hydrant, a bicycle locked to a signpost, a cat sitting in a window on the second floor, watching us pass with the monumental indifference of cats. Darius said, "It's cold tonight." I said, "It's October." He said, "October used to feel different when I was a kid." In Atlanta, October was still summer by Chicago standards. I said I could not imagine growing up somewhere that warm. He said, "You get used to things, then you move and you realize how used to them you were." I said, "Is that what happened when you moved here at 15? He said yes, and also no. He said, "The city was different from anything I had ever been in. Not just colder. The way people were in it was different. Atlanta had a different rhythm." He said he had been lonely for about a year, and then the city had clicked into place somehow, and he had stopped being lonely. I said, "What made it click?" He thought about this. He said, "I met people who felt like mine, who I recognized in some way I couldn't explain. That's the only way I know how to describe it, like recognition." I said I understood exactly what he meant because I did. He said, "Is that what it was like for you?" I said, "Growing up in Wisconsin." He said, "Coming to Chicago, coming to this specific version of your life." I said, "Yes." I said, "I came here when I was 22, and I met Camille at a gallery opening, and we talked for 4 hours, and I thought, this is what it is supposed to feel like." He said, "You and Camille." I said, "And eventually you and everyone." He said, "Eventually me." I said, "Yes." He smiled at the sidewalk. I watched it happen out of my peripheral vision rather than looking directly at it, which was discipline, which was the system. He said, "I didn't know that you felt that way about the city." I said, "You've never asked." He said, "I suppose I haven't." He said, "What else don't I know about you?" I said, "What kind of question is that?" He said, "A genuine one. 3 years is long enough to know someone and still not know them completely." I said, "That's one way to look at it." He said, "What's another way?" I said, 3 years is long enough to know someone better than most people get to know anyone." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Both things can be true." I said, "Yes, they usually are." His apartment building was a narrow 3-story on a side street between 2 larger buildings, the kind of building that had been many things before it became apartments. You could see the architectural evidence of previous identities in the high ceilings and the wide windows, and the layout that did not quite make sense for residential use but worked anyway. He had the top floor, which he had told me when he first moved in was the only apartment he had ever looked at that felt like it fit the shape of his life. I had never asked him to explain what he meant by that. Some things you know not to press. The stairwell was narrow and warm and smelled like the old wood of the walls, and he went up ahead of me because the stairs were barely wide enough for one person and his shoulders were wider than mine. I followed. I looked at the back of his green jacket. I looked at the light fixture on the second floor landing, which was one of those old glass globes that must have been installed 60 years ago and never replaced. By the time we reached the 3rd floor, I had run through the entire alphabet twice in terms of things I could see or smell or hear in the stairwell. The system was intact. His apartment was how I remembered it from the last time I had been here, which was 3 months ago. Dinner with just the 2 of us, and a film we had been meaning to watch for a year. It was a long, narrow space with high ceilings and the large windows overlooking the side street and the building's small back courtyard. He had a good couch, dark blue, deep cushions, the kind of couch that had clearly been chosen with the understanding that it would see significant use. His books were organized in a system I had once asked him to explain, and he had explained, but the explanation required understanding how his mind organized categories, which was its own kind of architecture, logical and specific and not immediately decipherable from the outside. He took his jacket off and hung it by the door and turned the lamp in the corner on rather than the overhead light, which gave the room a warmer quality, amber rather than white. He asked if I wanted anything, water or tea or something else. I said water would be good. He went to the kitchen, which was separated from the living room by a half wall, and I could see him moving in there, the back of his white shirt, his hands running water into 2 glasses. I sat on the couch and arranged myself and stopped arranging myself because there is nothing more suspicious than a person who is very visibly arranging themselves. He came back with 2 glasses of water and set one on the coffee table in front of me and kept the other and stood for a moment in the middle of the room in the way people stand when they are not sure what they want to do next. Then he sat down on the other end of the couch, not in the middle where a person might sit if they were completely relaxed and not thinking about proximity, but at the far end, and pulled one knee up and half turned toward me. He said, "I keep thinking about what you said earlier, about recognition, about meeting people who feel like yours." I said, "What about it?" He said, "I think I take it for granted, knowing who mine are." He said, "I don't know if I always did." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "When I was growing up, the people who were mine were my family, my friends from the neighborhood. That was the whole map. Then the map got bigger and I had to figure out who I was in more of it." He said, "I think I was pretty conventional for a while, in what I wanted, in what I thought was available to me to want." I said, "And now?" He looked at me. He said, "I don't know. I'm not sure I'm finished figuring it out." This was not the kind of statement Darius Cole typically made. He was, in my experience, a person who knew things about himself, who had examined his own interior life with the same methodical care he brought to his work, who did not offer uncertainty without having first confirmed its dimensions. Saying, "I don't know, I'm not sure I'm finished figuring it out," in that particular quiet voice at 2:15 in the morning, watching me across his dark blue couch, was not nothing. I said, "What are you trying to figure out?" He said, "I'm not entirely sure." "Which is the problem?" he said. "Have you ever felt like you understood the shape of your life and then looked up one day and weren't sure the shape was right anymore? Not because anything was wrong with it, just because you couldn't tell if it fit?" I said yes. I said I had felt that very specifically at 21, and it had changed everything. He said, "What changed?" I said, "I stopped trying to fit the shape I thought I was supposed to be and started fitting the one I actually was." He said, "Was that easy?" I said, "No." He said, "But it was right?" I said, "It was the only option once I knew. You can't unknow something like that." He nodded. He looked at the window for a moment. Then he looked back at me. He said, "You've never asked me things about my life, certain things." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "You know what I mean." I said, "I ask you things all the time." He said, "You ask me about work and about what I'm reading and about how I'm feeling after breakups. You don't ask me about." He paused. He said, "You know the things you don't ask." I felt the entire atmosphere of the room shift slightly, the way a barometric pressure changes before weather. I said, "I don't ask because it's not my business." He said, "But you must think about it." I said, "Darius." He said, "I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable." I said, "You're not. I'm just not sure where this conversation is going." He said, "I'm not either." He said, "That's kind of the point." I said, all right. I said, what do you want to know that you haven't asked me? He said, I've always known that you're gay. Obviously. I said, obviously. He said, but I've never known if you were at any point in this. He gestured between the two of us without completing the sentence. I could feel my heartbeat in my chest, and in my fingertips, and in the back of my throat. I said, in what? He said, if there was ever anything between us, on your end. He said, I'm not asking to make you uncomfortable. I'm asking because I need to know. I thought about the system. I thought about the rules. I thought about how carefully I had maintained them for 2 years and 3 months and however many days. Then I thought about the fact that I was sitting on his couch at 2:15 in the morning after missing the last train, specifically because I did not get up and leave when I knew I should, and that this had been a choice, even if I had not framed it that way to myself at the time. I said yes. I said it once, and it was enough. He did not move. He did not change his expression in any visible way. He was very still for what might have been 5 seconds or 30, and then he breathed out through his nose, not dramatically, not as a reaction, just as a person breathes when they have been holding something carefully and have set it down. He said, "Okay." I said, "Okay." He said, "Thank you for telling me." I said, "You asked." He said, "I know." He said, "I should tell you something." He said, "I have been." He stopped. He said, "For a while, there have been moments, with you specifically, that I have not known what to do with." I said, "What kind of moments?" He said, "Moments where something felt different than I expected it to feel, with you versus with anyone else. Moments that made sense as friendship and also felt like more than that. And I kept waiting for the feeling to resolve into something I could name, and it never quite did." He said, "I have thought about this a lot, more in the last 2 months than before, since Simone." He said, "When you're not with anyone, you have more time to look at what's actually there." I said, "And what did you see?" He said, "I saw you." He said, "I kept seeing you. The window behind me was letting in the cold from outside, and I could not feel it. The apartment was warm. My glass of water was on the coffee table between us, and I had not touched it. Darius was looking at me from the far end of the couch with an expression I did not have a name for, had never seen on his face in 3 years of knowing his face." I said, "Darius." He said, "I know." He said, "I know how this sounds." I said, "How does it sound?" He said, "Like something I should have thought about more carefully before I said it out loud." I said, "Or less carefully." He looked at me. He said, "What?" I said, "Sometimes the thinking gets in the way." He said, "For you?" I said, "All the time." He said, "I did not know that about you." I said, "You said there were things you didn't know." He said, "Yes." He said, "I think there are more of them than I realized." He moved, not dramatically, not all at once, just shifted slightly, fractionally, along the couch, the way a person moves when they are not aware they are moving, when the body makes a decision the mind is still catching up to. I did not move toward him. I was not capable of that particular action right now. I was sitting very still and thinking about all the rules I had made for myself and watching them dissolve one by one in the warm, amber light of his corner lamp. He said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Yes." He said, "When you're with someone, when you're actually with someone, is it different from how it is with me?" I said, "Different how?" He said, "In intensity, in quality." I said, "That is a complicated question." He said, "It doesn't have to be." I said, "Yes, it's different." He said, "How?" I said, "With other people, there's always been a kind of calculation. You weigh things. With you, there's never been a calculation, because I have never let myself start one." He said, Why not? I said, because some equations, once you begin them, change the problem. He was quiet. Then he said, what if the problem needs to change? I did not have an answer to that. Not one I could say without taking down every wall I had been building for 2 years and 3 months. So I sat there with the answer behind my sternum, burning like something with no name. And I looked at him, and he looked at me. And outside the city hummed its low 3 a.m. hum, and the lamp in the corner did not waver. He said, "Can I try something?" I said, "Try what?" He said, "Just." He said it like a sentence, with nothing after it, and stood up from the couch and closed the distance between us in 2 steps and sat down again, this time in the middle, close enough that the outside of his knee was touching the outside of mine. He said, "Is this all right?" I said yes, and my voice came out steadier than I deserved. He said, "I don't know what I'm doing." I said, "I know." He said, "I mean it. I have no idea." I said, "Neither do I." He said, "You've never, in the whole time, even once?" I said, "I was very committed to not doing anything about it." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because you were straight." He made a sound that was almost a laugh but wasn't quite. He said, "I thought I knew what I was." I said, "And now?" He said, "I'm starting to think I was missing information." He was looking at me like he had just noticed my mouth for the first time and could not figure out where else to look. His hand came up. It found my jaw. His thumb rested at the corner of my lips, barely touching, and the contact sent something through me that I have never had a word for and will never find one, because it was the specific feeling of something you have wanted so long that wanting it has become part of your internal architecture, finally pressing against the possibility of being real. He said, "Tell me to stop if I should stop." I said nothing. He leaned forward, 1 inch. His breath was warm and his hand was still on my jaw, and the city was somewhere far below us, and I was the most awake I had ever been in my life. His forehead came to rest against mine, very lightly, not kissing, just this, just foreheads touching in the dark. I closed my eyes. He said, "Tobias." I said, "I know." He said, "I mean it." I said, "I know you mean it." He said, "I've been thinking about this for longer than I'm comfortable admitting." I said, "How long?" He said, "Long enough that tonight wasn't the first time I noticed. Tonight was the time I stopped pretending I hadn't." I said, "What stopped you before?" He said, "I didn't know what to do with it." I said, "And now you do?" He pulled back just enough to look at me. He said, "I know I don't want to waste any more time pretending it isn't there." He said, "Whether that makes me something I don't have a word for yet or not." I said, "It doesn't have to have a word." He said, "No." He said, "It just has to be real." I said, "It's real." He said, "Yes, there is a specific kind of silence that exists between 2 people when something has been said that cannot be unsaid, and both of them know it, and neither of them knows yet what it means for the next 5 minutes or the next 5 years. Darius and I were in the middle of that silence, his forehead against mine, his hand on my jaw, the lamp in the corner throwing amber light across everything, making the night feel both slower and more precious than nights usually feel. The city below us was doing what cities do at 3 a.m, which is mostly just breathing. That low, indistinct hum of a million lives temporarily paused. He had told me that tonight was not the first time he had noticed, that tonight was the time he stopped pretending he hadn't. I want to tell you what that felt like, to hear from a man I had loved in silence for 2 years and 3 months. The closest I can get is this. It felt like something structural inside me, something I had built specifically to hold weight, had been gently, carefully dismantled, and the weight it had been holding turned out to be lighter than I thought. Because I had been carrying it alone for so long, I had forgotten it didn't have to be that way. His thumb moved. Barely. Just a fraction of movement at the corner of my mouth. The pad of his thumb tracing the edge of my lower lip, like a question he did not have words for yet. I stayed still. I was very good at staying still. I had 2 years of practice. He said, "I don't know how to do this." I said, "Neither do I." He said, "You must have more experience with wanting someone you weren't sure you were supposed to want." I thought about this. I said, yes and no. I said, when I was 21 and figuring myself out, there was a period where everything I felt seemed like evidence of something being wrong with me. But once I accepted it, the wanting felt straightforward. The problem wasn't the wanting. The problem was finding someone who wanted back. He said, "And now?" I said, "Now is different." He said, "How?" I said, "Because now I know what I feel, and I know what it costs." He said, "What does it cost?" I said, "Darius." He said, "Tell me." I said, "If this goes wrong, I lose you. And you are one of the things in my life I cannot afford to lose." He pulled back. Not all the way, just enough to look at my whole face rather than just my mouth. His hand dropped from my jaw to my shoulder, resting there, the warm weight of it completely present. He said, "I have thought about exactly that." He said, "I've been thinking about whether this is something I'm doing because I'm lonely or because proximity and affection are getting confused." I said, "Have you concluded anything?" He said, "Yes. I've been lonely before. I've been single before. It has never felt like this." He said, "I can tell the difference between wanting comfort and wanting you specifically. This is the second thing." I said, "Wanting me specifically is not a small claim." He said, "No." He said, "It's the most specific thing I have ever said out loud, which is part of why it took me this long to say it." He moved his hand on my shoulder. Not grabbing, not pulling, just present. The way he was always just present. The quality of him that had undone me from the beginning. He said, "Can I ask you something without you answering defensively?" I said, "I will try." He said, "In all the time we have been friends, was there ever a moment where you thought I might, that something in me might?" I said, "Yes." He said, "When?" I said, "There were small things, not conclusions, just moments where you looked at me in a way that I decided I was probably misreading, because the alternative was something I couldn't let myself consider." He said, "You weren't misreading." I said, "I know that now." He said, "I'm sorry it took this long." I said, "There is nothing to be sorry for. This happened the way it happened." He smiled, not the full one he used in groups, wide and generous. This was the quieter version he wore when something landed precisely, when a thing was true enough to earn more than acknowledgement. It was the smile I had loved first, before any of the rest of it. Seeing it from this distance, with his hand on my shoulder and his eyes on my face, felt like being handed something I had been reaching toward for a very long time. He said, "What do you want to happen right now?" I said, "I want to know what you want." He said, "I asked first." I thought about deflecting. I thought about all the careful non-answers I had prepared over 2 years for exactly this theoretical conversation. Then I thought about his forehead against mine and the way his thumb had traced the edge of my mouth. And I let the careful non-answers go. I said, "I want you to kiss me." He didn't move for a moment. He said, "Okay." He said, I want that too. He said, I just want you to know that when I do, it won't be because I'm confused or because it's late or because of anything except that I have wanted to for longer than I knew how to name. I said, Darius? He said, yes. I said, stop narrating and do the thing. He laughed, out loud, surprised, the real one. And then he was leaning forward and his mouth met mine. It was not like I had imagined it. I want to be honest about that. I had imagined it. Of course I had, in the way you imagine anything you have wanted long enough, with the specific, intense accuracy that longing produces. But the imagination is always a controlled version of the thing, cleaned up, sequential. The real thing was none of those. The real thing was the warmth of his mouth and the small sound he made at the first contact. Barely a sound, more like a breath with shape to it. And the way his hand moved from my shoulder to the back of my neck with a sureness that did not match the uncertainty he had described moments before. Like his hands knew what they wanted, even when his words were still working it out. He kissed me the way he did everything, with complete attention. Not performance, attention. I felt the full weight of it, the specificity of being focused on by a mind like his. He was noticing me. He was holding me. His hand at the back of my neck was not casual. I kissed him back, and the system I had built over 2 years and 3 months dissolved so completely, I could not have told you what its rules had been. There was no system. There was the lamp in the corner, and the city outside, and the warmth of him, and the impossible reality of this moment, replacing every imagined version I had stored away in the places where I kept things I was not supposed to want. We pulled apart after a moment. Not far. He stayed close, his forehead finding mine again, like that was the resting position between kisses, the place where we landed. He said, okay. I said, okay. He said, that was. I said, yes. He said, I need a minute. I said, take as many as you need. He pulled back enough to look at me. His expression was difficult to describe. Not shocked, not confused, settled somehow, like a piece of information that had been uncertain had just been confirmed and could now be filed in the correct location. He said, I feel like I should explain something. I said, you don't have to explain anything. He said, I want to. He said, I'm not someone who does things without understanding what they mean. I said, I know. He said, so I want to be clear that I understand what this means. I said, what does it mean? He said, it means I want more than tonight. It means this is not an experiment. He said, I've had enough time to look at you from the outside of this, to know that what I feel is not passing. He said, I don't do passing. I said, I know you don't. He said, so whatever this is, it's real. To me, it is real. My chest did something complicated. I said, I know. He said, do you? I said, yes. I said, you are one of the most deliberate people I have ever met, and you would not be here, saying this, if you weren't sure. He said, I'm not sure of everything. I said, what are you sure of? He said, you. He said, I'm sure of you specifically. He said, everything else I'm willing to figure out as it comes. I said, that is a very significant thing to say. He said, I know. He said, I mean it. He kissed me again. This one was slower, more certain. The calibration of someone who has done something once and is doing it again with more information. His hand at the back of my neck did not move. My hand, which I had not consciously decided to do anything with, had found the front of his shirt, fingers curved lightly into the fabric, not pulling, just holding, an anchor for both of us. When we separated this time, he said, tell me something true. I said, what kind of something? He said, Something you haven't said before. I thought about it. I said, the night you called me from the parking garage after you and Priya broke up, when I stayed on the phone with you for 2 hours. He said, yes. I said, when I hung up, I sat in my apartment for 30 minutes just breathing. He said, why? I said, because for 2 hours I had been what you needed, and the whole time all I wanted was to be there in person. And I couldn't. And I didn't know what to do with the gap between what I could give you and what I wanted to give you. He was very still. He said, I didn't know that. I said, I know you didn't. He said, Tobias. I said, don't apologize. I said, I don't need the apology. What happened, happened the way it was supposed to. I'm here now. So are you. That's what matters. He said, okay? He said, I'm still. I said, I know. I said, show me instead of telling me. He said, what does that mean? I said, it means keep going. He looked at me for a moment with that dark, settled gaze. Then he stood from the couch and extended his hand. I took it. He was warm, his hand larger than mine, and the grip was easy, not tight, just present. He said, come here. And I went. The bedroom was at the back of the apartment. He turned on the nightstand lamp rather than the overhead, which I had expected, because he was someone who preferred ambient light in all things. The room was plain and clean, the bed large with dark linen. He stood on his side, and I stood on mine, and we looked at each other across the width of it. He said, is this too fast? I said, we've known each other for 3 years. He said, you know what I mean. I said, is it too fast for you? He said, no. I've been thinking about this long enough that it doesn't feel fast. I said, then no. He said, okay. He said, I want to be honest with you. I said, you have been. He said, about what I know and what I don't know. He said, I know what I feel. I am less certain about the mechanics. I said, that's all right. He said, is it? I said, yes. I said, we figure it out. He said, together? I said, that's the idea. He smiled the quiet smile. He said, okay. He said, come here. I came around to his side. We were standing close together, closer than we had stood in 3 years of friendship except for the accidental proximity of narrow stairwells and crowded rooms that I had always carefully not made more of than it was. But this was deliberate. This was both of us standing here deliberately. He said, I've been wondering about this, about what it would feel like, being close to you like this, not as your friend. I said, and he said, it feels like something I should have done sooner. He said, I don't know how to explain that. I said, you don't have to explain it. His hands found my waist, not aggressively, not with the purpose of going anywhere immediately, just settling there at my sides, feeling the shape of me. I put my hands on his chest, against his shirt, and felt the warmth of him through the fabric. I said, you're nervous. He said, a little. I said, me too. He said, you? I said, yes. He said, why? I said, because I have wanted this, and managed not to have it for a very long time. And now that it is real, I am afraid I will wake up. He said, you won't wake up. I said, I know. He said, I'm here. He said, I'm going to be here. He said, I'm not going anywhere. He kissed me again, and this time, there was nothing tentative in it. The nervousness from 30 seconds ago had not disappeared, but it had been reclassified into something else, into the energy that exists in any moment when something real is beginning, when you step from the edge of anticipating into the current of the thing itself. I will not give you every detail of what happened after that. Not because it was not worth the words, but because some things become smaller when you put language around them. And what happened in his bedroom in those hours was not a small thing. What I will tell you is this. He was present in a way that felt almost overwhelming, The full force of his attention turned entirely toward us. He made sounds that surprised him, sounds of discovery, like he was finding out things about himself in real time. Every time he looked at me, truly looked, I felt something expand in my chest that I had been keeping compressed for a very long time. There is a thing that happens when you are finally with someone you have loved in secret. It is not just the relief of the secret being over, not just the satisfaction of desire finally met, though it is both of those things. It is something stranger. It is seeing the person you love as they actually are, without the filter of management, without the careful editing you do to yourself when you are around someone you cannot have. It is the first time you are fully present with them. Nothing withheld, nothing rerouted, just you and them, and the truth of what is between you. I was fully present with Darius Cole for the first time, and he was fully present with me. He held me like I was something, not fragile, not precarious, something worth holding carefully, something that mattered to the holding. His hands on me were not careless. Nothing about him was ever careless, but the particular deliberateness of his hands in those hours was something I will carry in the part of my memory where the important things live. At some point, deep in the middle of the night, we lay still. He was on his back, and I had turned toward him, my head on the pillow next to his, both of us breathing at the same rate, slowly, coming back to ourselves from somewhere that had required us to leave ourselves behind for a while. The lamp was still on. His hand had found mine on the sheet between us, and was holding it loosely, like something he had picked up because it belonged there. He said, "Hey." I said, "Hey." He said, "Are you all right?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I mean, really." I said, "I mean, really, yes." He turned his head toward me. I turned mine toward him. He said, "I want to ask you something." I said, "You can ask me anything." He said, "What is this going to look like? In the morning, next week, 6 months from now?" I said, "I don't know." He said, "Is that okay?" I said, "Yes. Some things you figure out by being in them." He said, "I've never been in anything like this before." I said, "I know." He said, "Does that scare you?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "A little." He said, "What scares you?" I said, "The possibility that you work through whatever this is and find that it was specific to me and not a broader truth about yourself." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I mean the possibility that you feel this for me and only me, and that eventually that's not enough for you." He was quiet for a long time. He said, "And if that's true," I said, "then I want to know it before either of us is further in than we can come back from." He said, "That's very practical for someone who just..." He gestured loosely at the room. I said, "I know." I said, "I can be in love with you and also practical." He stopped. He said, "In love." It was not a question. I said, "Yes." I said, "I thought that was clear from the context." He said, "Say it again." I said, "I'm in love with you, Darius. I have been for a while." He looked at the ceiling. He said, "Tobias." I said, "I know." He said, 2 years and you said nothing." I said, "I was very committed to doing nothing about it." He said, "I know that now." He said, "I need you to understand something." I said, "Okay." He said, "What you asked about, whether this is specific to you or something broader." He said, "I've been thinking about this for more than 6 months, and I don't have a simple answer, and I'm not going to pretend to have one. What I know is that it's you, that whatever this is, it is organized around you." He said, "Whether that tells me something general about myself, or whether you are the only exception to a pattern." He paused. He said, "I honestly don't know yet." I said, "And you're okay with not knowing?" He said, I'm okay with finding out. He said, I don't want to make you a placeholder for a question I'm working through. I want to be here because I want to be here. He said, is that enough right now? I thought about 2 years of careful management. I thought about the parking garage phone call and the 30 minutes of breathing after it. I thought about his forehead against mine and the way he kissed me for the first time with that complete attention that was entirely him. I said, yes, it's enough. I said, I'm not asking you to have answers you don't have. I'm asking you to be honest with me while you're finding them. He said, that I can do. I said, then yes. He said, good. He looked at me for a moment in the amber light. He said, and for what it's worth. I said, yes. He said, when I figure it out, whatever the answer is, you are the reason I'm looking. He said, you made me willing to look somewhere I had been looking past. He said, that's not a small thing. I said, no. He said, what I feel for you is not complicated. It is the most uncomplicated thing in my current life. He said, you are the thing that is clear. The lamp was still on. The night outside was beginning that almost imperceptible shift toward the first gray suggestion of morning that happens long before anything as dramatic as dawn. His hand was holding mine on the sheet between us. He said, go to sleep. I said, I don't want to. He said, why not? I said, because I'm afraid of what the morning is going to feel like. He said, what do you think it's going to feel like? I said, changed. He said, changed how? I said, I don't know what version of us exists on the other side of tonight. He said, a better one. He said it without hesitation. He said, a more honest one. The one where we actually are what we've been to each other instead of the one where one of us is pretending. I said, I've been pretending for 2 years. He said, I know. He said, I'm sorry it took me this long to make it so you didn't have to. I said, stop apologizing. He said, I'm working on it. He said, sleep, Tobias. I said, okay. I closed my eyes. He shifted next to me, and I felt the warmth of him against my shoulder, and his breathing slow into the rhythm of someone settling toward sleep. The lamp was still on. Neither of us turned it off. I thought about the morning. Then I stopped thinking about the morning and just felt the warmth of him next to me, the specific warmth of Darius Cole, who I had loved in silence and who had kissed me on his couch at 3 in the morning and held my hand in the dark while we talked ourselves toward something real. I slept. The morning came in through the large windows, pale and quiet, October light thin and without drama, the way some of the most significant mornings arrive, dressed in ordinary clothes. I woke before he did. I lay still for several minutes, aware of where I was and who was next to me, both of those facts settling in with the quiet certainty of things that are actually true. He was on his side, facing away from me, his shoulder visible above the dark linen, his breathing slow and even. I looked at the ceiling. I did an inventory of how I felt. This was the thing I had been afraid of, the morning version, the version where daylight would make things smaller or stranger or regrettable. What I found instead was this. I felt, for the first time in 2 years, unclenched, like a fist in my chest had finally opened its fingers. The careful management was gone. The system was gone. I was lying in Darius Cole's bed in the morning light with none of the armor I had been wearing since the night I admitted to myself what I felt. And I did not miss the armor. The absence of it felt like a very specific kind of freedom. He stirred. I turned my head. He was surfacing from sleep slowly, his eyes opening, the ceiling registering. And then he turned his head and found me looking at him, and was quiet for a moment. He said, "You're still here." I said, "You told me I wouldn't wake up." He said, "Right." He said, "I did say that." He turned onto his back and breathed out. He said, "Good morning." I said, "Good morning." He said, "How do you feel?" I said, "I'll tell you if you tell me first." He said, "I feel like something has been resolved that I didn't know needed resolving." I said, "Is that good?" He said, "Yes." "Very good." He said, "You?" I said, unclenched, for the first time in a long time. He smiled at the ceiling. He said, "Okay." He said, "Good." He got up and made coffee. This was not a dramatic gesture. It was just what he did. The first thing every morning, the ritual I had observed across 3 years of arriving at his apartment and finding it already done. He went to the kitchen in yesterday's clothes, and I heard the grinder and the water in the machine beginning its work. By the time I came to the kitchen, he was leaning against the counter with 2 mugs waiting, and he had opened the window above the sink so that the cool October air came in and mixed with the coffee and made the kitchen feel very particular and very good. He handed me a mug. I took it. We stood at the window together, looking out at the back courtyard where a single tree had gone almost entirely gold. He said, "I want to say something." I said, "Okay." He said, "I know we have a lot to figure out. I know I have things to think through about myself. I know I cannot offer you certainty about things I haven't settled yet." He said, "But I want to offer you this." I said, "What?" He said, "I'm not going to retreat." He said, "I know that might be a concern, that in the morning light I might want to put distance between us and call it a moment." He said, "I'm not going to do that. Last night was real, and I am going to behave like it was real. I am going to figure myself out in your direction rather than away from it." I said, "In my direction." He said, "Yes, toward you rather than away from you. Whatever I find out about myself, I want to find it out, while I'm also finding out about this, about us." I said, "This is the most you have ever spoken consecutively at this hour of the morning." He said, "I know." He said, "I have things to say." I said, "I know you do." He said, "Are you okay with what I said?" I said, "Yes, more than okay." He said, "Good." We drank our coffee by the open window, with the gold tree below us, and the pale light coming in, and the city waking up in increments below us. He was next to me, and I was next to him, and neither of us was pretending, which was the best thing I could say about any morning of my life. He said, "I need to tell Camille." I said, "You think she doesn't already know?" He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Camille has been watching us for 2 years, and she is the most perceptive person either of us knows." He processed this. He said, "She's going to be very pleased with herself." I said, "Catastrophically pleased." He said, "She'll make a toast." I said, "She'll make a speech." He said, "God." I said, "There's no escaping it." He said, "We could not tell her." I said, "She'll know the moment she sees us in the same room." He said, "Is it that obvious?" I said, "You're standing 6 inches closer to me than you were yesterday." He considered this. He said, "Is 6 inches significant?" I said, "To Camille, it is a landmark." He laughed. "The real one. The one from somewhere genuine." I had heard it 10,000 times, and it still hit me the same way, like something opening. He set down his mug and turned toward me. He reached out and tucked a piece of hair back from my forehead, in a gesture so casual and so intimate at the same time that it stopped my breath for a moment. He said, "I'm glad you missed the train." I said, "I didn't miss it." He looked at me. I said, "I knew I was going to miss it, and I didn't get up and leave." He said, "Why not?" I said, "Because I didn't want to." He said, "Because of me?" I said, "Yes." He said, "What were you hoping would happen?" I said, "I wasn't letting myself hope for anything specific." He said, "But you stayed anyway." I said, "Yes." He said, "That is a very Tobias thing to do." I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "It means you will protect yourself up to the very last possible moment and then choose to stay anyway." He said, "I have been watching you do that for 3 years, and it is one of my favorite things about you." I said, "You have been watching me for 3 years." He said, "Yes." He said, "I've been watching you since the night we met." I said, "As a friend." He said, "At first." He said, "And then gradually, as something else I didn't have a word for, and so I filed it under friend and left it there." I said, "And the file grew." He said, "Very slowly, until it was not really a friend file anymore." I said, "What is it now?" He said, "A different category, one I'm creating as I go." He said, "You're the first entry in it." He kissed me in the kitchen by the open window, with the coffee getting cold, and the gold tree in the courtyard below us, and October light over both of us. And I kissed him back, without any of the careful management I had been carrying for 2 years. The management was gone. The system was gone. There was just this, just his mouth on mine and his hands at my waist, and the specific gravity of him. This man I had loved from behind a wall I built myself, now on the same side of the wall as me. We spent the morning in the ordinary way of two people figuring out that they want to be in the same space, slowly, with the specific pleasure of no longer needing to be careful about it. He made eggs because he was someone who made eggs on Saturday mornings regardless of what Friday night had been. I sat on the kitchen counter and watched him cook, and we talked about nothing in particular, about the party and about Camille's decorating choices and about the book he was reading. Easy talk, the kind we had always had, except that I was on his counter and he was touching my knee when he passed back and forth to the stove, and neither of these things required explanation. After breakfast, we sat on his couch with more coffee, and he said, "What happens now?" I said, "We have breakfast and drink coffee, and at some point I go home." He said, "I meant in general." I said, "In general, we take it one step at a time." He said, "That's not very specific." I said, "No." He said, "Is that something you're comfortable with?" I said, "I spent 2 years being very uncomfortable with something I had no control over and managing it anyway. I think I can handle something uncertain that I'm actually part of." He said, "Fair point." He said, "I want to see you this week." I said, "We see each other all the time." He said, "I mean specifically, as this, whatever we are deciding we are." I said, "Dinner?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Okay." He said, "Wednesday?" I said, "Wednesday works." He said, "I'll cook." I said, "You don't have to." He said, "I want to." He said, "I want to do the ordinary things with you, with everything on the table between us. No management on your part, no pretending on mine." I said, "Just us." He said, "Just us." I left his apartment at 1 in the afternoon. He walked me to the door, which he did not need to do. It was 30 feet from the couch to the door. He held it open for me, and I stepped into the hallway, and then I turned around because I could not leave without turning around. He was leaning against the door frame, arms loosely crossed, looking at me with that quiet, dark gaze. He said, "Wednesday." I said, "Wednesday." He said, "I'll text you." I said, "I know you will." He said, "Get home safe." I said, "It's the middle of the day." He said, "Still." I said, "Okay." I walked out into the October afternoon and started toward the train, and my phone buzzed before I reached the corner. A text from Darius. He said, "I keep thinking about what you said, that you were afraid of what the morning would feel like." I said, "I know." He said, "I hope it felt all right." I said, "It felt unclenched," like I said. He said, "Good." He said, "Wednesday feels very far away." I said, "It's 4 days." He said, I know. He said, I'm not good at 4 days right now. I said, we talk every day anyway. He said, I know, but it's different now. I said, yes. He said, I'll call you tonight. I said, okay. He said, not because I need to, because I want to. I said, I know the difference. He said, I know you do. He said, go home, Tobias. I put my phone away and kept walking. I called Petra from the platform. She answered on the second ring with the quality of someone who has been waiting. She said, hello. I said, so. She said, so. I said, I stayed over. She said, and. I said, and he kissed me. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, say that again. I said, Darius kissed me. She said, on your own initiative or his? I said, I think both, mostly his. She said, Tobias. She said it the way she says my name when she needs time to process something. Then she said, are you okay? I said, yes. I said, I'm more than okay. I said, I'm frightened and uncertain, and I don't know exactly what we are, and he has a lot of figuring out to do, and I have 2 years of careful management to dismantle. She said, but. I said, but I feel more like myself than I have in a very long time. She said, is that what it feels like? I said, that's what it feels like. She said, I'm glad. She said, I'm so glad for you. I said, don't say you told me so. She said, I would never. She said, I also told you so. The train arrived, I got on. I held the rail and watched the city move past the windows. The familiar passage of buildings and signs and people. All of it completely unchanged from any other Saturday and completely different from every other Saturday I had ever ridden this train. I thought about Darius in his apartment, probably at the window where he liked to stand when he was thinking about something, the something being us. Loving someone you cannot have makes you smaller than you are, not through any fault of yours or theirs. Just through the constant work of containment. You become the version of yourself that fits within the constraints. And when the constraint is lifted, when the thing you could not have becomes, against all your careful rules and sensible systems, actually available, actually real, you expand back into the shape you were before you started fitting yourself around the impossible. I was expanding. I could feel it, the specific sensation of taking up the space I was supposed to take up, without apology or careful management. It was going to be complicated. He had work to do in understanding himself, and I was going to have to be patient with that work without losing myself in it. We were going to have to build something new from what we had, using the materials of 3 years of friendship and one October night. And neither of us knew what the building would look like. There would be mornings harder than that first one. There would be conversations that required more than we knew how to give. There would be the Camille speech, which would be legendary. But he had said, I'm not going to retreat. He had said towards you rather than away from you. He had said, you are the thing that is clear. And Darius Cole did not say things he did not mean. The train stopped at my station. I got off. My phone buzzed one more time. He said, I forgot to tell you something. I said, what? He said, the umbrella you left here 6 months ago is still in the hall closet. I said, I was wondering where that was. He said, I kept it. I said, why? He said, I don't know. He said, seemed important at the time. I said, to keep my umbrella. He said, to keep something of yours. I said, Darius. He said, I know. He said, I'm working on being less cryptically honest and more just honest. I said, I prefer just honest. He said, I know. He said, Wednesday. I said, Wednesday. I put my phone away and walked the last block home. I sat on my own couch and looked at my ceiling and thought about a man 4 blocks and a train ride away who had kissed me in amber lamplight and held my hand in the dark and said, "You are the thing that is clear." I thought about the morning, the gold tree, the coffee, his hands tucking my hair back like it was something he had been doing for years, and had only just been allowed to do without pretending it meant nothing. I had spent 2 years making rules. I had been careful and sensible and thoroughly, meticulously responsible with a love I was not supposed to have. And then I had stayed too long at a party, and I had missed the last train, and Darius Cole had put his thumb at the corner of my mouth and said, "I've been thinking about this for longer than I'm comfortable admitting." And every rule I had made dissolved like sugar in warm water, cleanly, completely, with nothing left behind. Sometimes the right thing does not look like the system you built to protect yourself from it. Sometimes it looks like a man in a dark green jacket who has been watching you from across rooms for a year without knowing what the watching meant. Who calls you from parking garages and walks you home in October cold and says, "I kept seeing you," and means it, and has been meaning it longer than he knew. Who is brave enough finally, on a Friday night in the 3rd year of knowing you, to stop pretending he hasn't? I was in love with Darius Cole. I had been in love with him for 2 years and 3 months, and however many days, and for most of that time, it had been a private weight I carried alone, managed with care and the stubborn practicality that people who feel things deeply sometimes develop as a survival mechanism. But I was not carrying it alone anymore. And that, I thought, sitting in the pale October afternoon in my own apartment, with my coat still on and my coffee not yet made, and Wednesday still 4 days away, is what it feels like when the thing you were most afraid of turns out to be the thing you most needed. This is what it feels like when the system breaks in exactly the right place. This is what it feels like when the man who dated women his whole life sits down next to you on a window seat on a Friday night and looks at you and cannot look away.